Much, Veronica. So like Veronica said, I'm just going to kick us off with a quick walkthrough of a recent brief that DSP released, which looked at student debt outcomes of DSP participants compared to PhD students nationally. So before we dive into the specifics of that brief, I just want to set the foundation for the conversation today and the background for that brief, and talk a little bit about the current state of student debt in the United States. So as I'm sure all of you know, the national student debt burden is really immense. It's currently over $1.5 trillion and it continues to grow. Student loan debt now exceeds car loans and even credit card debt. And this accumulation of serious debt has consequences for the decisions that students are able to make and what they're able to afford, including the ability to buy houses, cars, and make other substantial life decisions. So those 1.5 trillion is obviously a very concerning and eye-boggling number, but it's also important to dig a bit deeper here. And when we do that, we know that research has shown that students of color continue to carry heavier student debt burdens than their peers. And we also know that students who have already accumulated high levels of debt from their undergraduate education may be less likely to pursue graduate school. And as we think about the path to professoriate, this is crucially important. If students are choosing not to attend graduate school due to their current student debt burdens or because they're concerned about taking on more debt, that immediately narrows the pipeline of potential faculty of color and helps to sustain and perpetuate the gaps we already see between faculty and student body demographics. As I'm sure all of you know, the mission of DSP is focused on increasing faculty diversity. And one strategy that the program uses is to help address the financial burden of graduate school by providing financial support to scholars. So last summer, we surveyed DSP alumni to try and get a better understanding of the relationship between program participation and student debt burdens. We used questions from the National Science Foundation's survey of earned doctorates and compared DSP alumni responses to those of PhD students nationally. And there's three main findings that we discussed in the brief, and that I want to briefly touch on here that we found from that survey. First, we found that DSP participants were more likely than all PhD students nationally to have large amounts of undergraduate debt. 72% of NSF survey respondents reported having no undergraduate debt, while only 41% of DSP respondents reported the same. And while just 5% of NSF respondents reported having $50,000 or more in undergraduate debt, 11% of DSP respondents reported that level of debt. And again, these results align with research that indicate that students of color are more likely to take on undergraduate student debt and in larger amounts than their white peers. The second key finding I want to touch on, we found that DSP participants were more likely than PhD students nationwide to report having graduate student loan debt. When asked about the amount of graduate student debt they had accumulated, approximately 68% of all NSF survey respondents reported having no graduate student debt, while only 31% of DSP survey respondents said the same. And finally, when we disaggregated the data and looked a bit deeper by race and ethnic group, we found that African American and American Indian or Alaska Native DSP participants were less likely to have significant graduate debt than their similar peers nationally. African American DSP respondents who did have graduate student debt were less likely to have significant debt. So just 16% of DSP respondents reported having graduate debt of $90,000 or more, while 25% of African American NSF respondents reported that level of graduate debt. In a similar vein, American Indian or Alaska Native DSP respondents reported lower levels of graduate debt as well. While 42% of this subgroup in the NSF survey reported having no graduate debt, 50% in the DSP survey did. So we know that programs that financially and professionally support underrepresented doctoral students, such as DSP, can provide one piece of the puzzle in helping to increase the number of PhDs of color and ultimately increasing faculty diversity. However, these survey results really show that even with the support of such programs, further work is really needed to decrease debt burdens for students of color. And systemic policy change at the federal, state, and institutional levels is needed to address the student debt crisis. Clearly, we all know that student debt has a serious impact on students' life trajectories, their career aspirations, graduate school attendance, and the level of future wealth they can accumulate. And currently, far too many underrepresented minority students shoulder a heavy burden of debt as they consider pursuing further education or entering the academy as faculty. So that just sets a little bit of a foundation here, and I hope you all get a chance to read the brief as well. But with that, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. A to introduce our wonderful panelists and kick off the conversation here. Dr. A, I think you're muted.
Thank you. I was. Hannah, thank you very much for the summary and getting us all on the same page on this issue. As all of us know, I think this is, I think it is a very important topic. It's one that has impacted all of us, impacted all of you, and it's worth discussing. It was also worth us answering programmatically because we wanted to know. We provide support, financial support students. Are we making a difference? Are we making some inroads into that armor, to that chink in the armor? We wanted to know if we're really making a difference here in terms of student debt. And we know student debt, through all the research that's been done, impacts students' trajectory, what they do, what they pursue, whether they go to school or not. And we wanted to have a discussion and look a little bit more deeply into that issue. So this afternoon, we thought we'd talk to some of our graduates and ask them about how debt has impacted them, their trajectory, and get some of their views on it. I'm very pleased to say that all of the people on the call today are program graduates and have had various experiences, and they know that they can reveal as much personally or they can talk more generally about the topic of debt. But it is something that has faced everyone, and we're anxious to get their take on how debt has impacted them, their decision making, and impacted actually where they have ended up, how it has shaped things. We have with us this afternoon Dr. Sabrina Atwater. She is at the Institute on Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at Georgia Tech University. She is an interdisciplinary sociologist with research interest in sociology of technology and social inequality. We also have with us Dr. Elsa Camargo. Dr. Camargo just got an appointment and will be starting her job very, very soon as an assistant professor of education leadership and policy studies at the University of Texas, Arlington, beginning this fall. Her research interests are in the areas of college access and success for minority students and career advancements of underrepresented faculty in higher education. Our final panelist today is Dr. Armond Perry. He is professor of social work and program director at the University of Louisville. Dr. Perry's research efforts center on intrapersonal and interpersonal and external factors that influence men's involvement in the lives of their children and families, as well as the impact of that involvement in the well-being of the family. So we have three very qualified folks to be here to talk about these issues. And what I want to do is just start out asking a set of questions. As you all listen to the discussion, please respond in chat if you have additional questions that are pertinent to the conversation. And we really want this to be a conversation, not just question and answer, but a conversation around these issues. And so let me start out by asking the question, well, we know that student debt is a serious interest in this country. I mean, our federal government is placing a lot of focus on trying to eliminate this debt and that debt burden that students are feeling when they come out of school. Well, how do you think we got here? What's happened? What's brought us to this place where this has become such a prominent issue? Any one of you want to just jump on that one immediately?
How do we get to where we are as it relates to
students?
As
in this crisis in this crisis area of Armand, of debt accumulation by undergraduates, and if you've got what was that number, Hannah? The percentage of students coming out of undergraduate students with debt, and then just thinking about that debt load, and then taking on additional educational responsibilities, getting into going on to graduate school and expanding that debt load. that can become a daunting hurdle to overcome, because nobody wants to go further into debt. So it certainly is a way of preventing people from making the decision. Oh, let me ask the question this way: was that a consideration when you all were coming out of your undergraduate, or were you all okay debt-wise undergraduate and making that decision? Did it impact your decision to go to graduate school? May or may not, but I'm posing that question to you.
Yeah. So back to the original question, how did we get here? I think, I mean, at the risk of oversimplifying it, I think that one of, if not the primary reasons is, I mean, post-secondary education is just more expensive now than it has been in days gone by, right? So my situation is a little bit unique because I started out at a small HBCU in my hometown, but I could remember tuition at Alabama State when I was there was $915 a semester, right? And so I could remember having a part-time job at Winn-Dixie and literally going to the registrar's office and scratching a check for my tuition for one semester. You know what I mean? Like that's just not feasible in a contemporary context, right? So, I mean, tuition being $5-6 grand, and that's at a state-supported institution. If you're at a private school, forget about it.
Yeah. Let me also give you all a little bit of context to go with that. Over the last 25, 30 years in the United States, states have been funding for higher education from state funds has been going down. Mm-hmm. That's why your tuitions are going up, because you got to cover those costs some kind of way. So we've got a 30-year trend of, if you will, reduced funding for higher education in the United States. That's why your prices, the experience you've had, I mean, you're saying, hey, it was back when I started. I can remember when I was in school, which, was a generation ago, but people could work and go to school and pay their tuition and do all those things all at once. Students can't do that today because tuition is too far out of sight. I mean, they couldn't even begin to pay off one semester's worth of tuition, much less a year and 4 years or 6 or 8 years worth of education. They can't do it anymore.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. When I did the math on it, with the amount of money that students pay at my current institution for one semester's worth of work, that would have gotten me up through halfway through my entire program as an undergrad.
Yep.
And so, I mean, that's without any significant, or at least relatively consistent increase in compensation on the back end, right? So as wages have not jumped up in proportion to tuition costs, and so there's some imbalance there, right? You end up paying more and not getting as much out of it on the back end, and so that causes a crunch for folks. In terms of the second question, whether or not it influenced or impacted the decision to go to graduate school, again, I consider myself to be really, really fortunate in that it didn't, but that's because I went to school on scholarships, you know what I mean? So, and then when I went to work on my PhD, again, really, really fortunate in that SREB came through for me and put me in a position to where I was able to get in and get out without having a significant financial burden placed on my shoulders after having graduated. I think that's the reason why programs like SREB are so important, because the honest truth is, and I may be sort of burying the lead here, and I want to monitor myself and make sure that I'm sharing the stage here, but had it not been for SREB, I don't think there would have been a Dr. Armond Perry, right? It was, the graduate school would have been cost prohibitive. And more importantly than whether or not there would have been a Dr. Armond Perry, but I would imagine that for the hundreds and thousands of scholars that have come through and graduated and are out in the academy now, I would imagine that the same thing applies for many of those folks as well. And so again, so we talked about the implications for faculty diversity in colleges and universities across the campus. I think they're far-reaching. I think I'll stop there, and I'll certainly try to monitor myself.
Yeah, I want to maybe speak to the disparity piece in the question, right?
Yes.
Because cost has gone up for everyone. So that does that really get us to looking at then why are these gaps still here? Why, the numbers, the brief kind of points out in that the debt ratio though hasn't retain any equity between students of color and their white counterparts in the impact, right, on these pursuits. And I think that has three arms to that: historical, institutional, and individual. Historically, the connection between economy and education has somewhat was diluted until now. Cost of higher ed is so much that people realize this is an enterprise, right? There is the economic factor to it. Our students, and many of us, when you're making decisions about college attainment, I can't tell you the number of students at Georgia Tech that get accepted and they'll say that it's their dream school, but can't pursue it purely based on cost, right? So the economic impact on decision making is there, but the disparity is that that economic slate and economic network is not equivalent. How we fund grad education is either people can pay out the pocket, you get some type of grant from federal, or these earned scholarships that's based on certain resources, abstracts, aptitudes in that's not equitable in environments and across the board. So I think once you get to higher ed, those things get exacerbated. That historical effect, what's your financial input? Who writes these recommendations for awards and scholarships and fellowships, and who has that network already in place? All those gaps just continue to be expounded. I think institutionally, there's some responsibility there too. As higher ed institutions, we have continued a model, although we broadened things like access, many of our DEI initiatives were around access and recruitment, not so much retention and support, right? So get them in, but how one is thriving and functioning is very seldom looked at, much more now recently, right? But the number of loans it took you to complete was like, you getting a degree though, you getting this opportunity. I think individually, because of the denying of access and equity and et cetera, I think for students of color, oftentimes acceptance was seen as a valued opportunity. So if you get in, if you get accepted, you pursue it. And even if that means taking on some debt and et cetera, rather than, that's the opportunity, because it is a way to even finance one's trajectory forward, one's being in multiple space. I can go to school and take out a loan at this interest rate and get a degree, but I also get income and sometimes housing and support and all of that, versus stay and do what, right? And so the loan has a different attractive mechanism. So I think all of those things come into play: the historical, financial, economic network and connection between education and economy, the institutional role of that. Cost has been very much individualized weight. And then individually, I say for me, it was a major factor because I was electrical engineer undergrad. I left and worked in the field. So I was a senior engineer trying to decide about coming back to graduate studies. And even with the SRB, I had 2 fellowships and a presidential fellowship from Georgia Tech. And all of that combined was a fourth of my salary that I had to make a decision to walk away from and say, what's driving this pursuit? So it absolutely was a factor, going in, knowing there would be some debt accumulation, and how that would factor in what I saw as an outcome. And we'll talk a little bit more, I think, when you get to your next question about those factors. But yeah, I think it's we got here from policy at multiple ways and how we approach the connection between education and economics.
Yeah, and you just alluded to something. I think you know, as all of us, as you study this, and this is an important area that all of us, just as being good citizens, ought to be paying close attention to, because it impacts our families. It impacts the decisions of our families. But Dr. Atwater, you just touched on something that reminded me of, you said, yeah, this thing has become an enterprise. The whole debt, the debt, the borrowing, it has become an enterprise when you let banks get into the business, and I do mean business, of providing student loans. You know, banks are about profit, and they're trying to turn a profit. You know, the impact on that individual student, really and truly, they could care less. All they care at the end of the day is you're paying that thing back, and they're making their interest, and their shareholders are getting their return on the dollar invested in that branch or that bank. At the end of the day, and it has become a enterprise in itself that really is not set up to help students achieve their goals and think about their future prospects, because they're burdened so heavily with the weight of the loans they're having to take out. And as all of you know, I mean, you're reading the newspaper, you're listening to the news, and depending upon what field one is in, you know, those decisions, you know, you're an engineer. To your point, I had to make a decision. I get all, you know, I'm used to living at a level, and I had to make a decision about long term, you know, what I wanted, what's going to make me happy. And, you know, I'm going to forego this income to live off, you know, as you said, a fourth of what I've been living off of for X number of years. But you were in a field that, you know, there either in industry or even in the academy, there's a payoff at the end. But let's just say that I'll pick on the humanities, but that humanities major, it's a whole different it's a whole different intellectual processing that's got to go on, because, you know, you can accumulate enormous debt, and the types of jobs and the types of pay that you can look to get when you come out, it's just not going to get you out of that debt. And you're in, you know, and those interest rates you had to sign up for are accumulating. And again, they're at such high levels that you just, you know, you just see the thing spiraling down. You just can't get out of it, because the debt's accumulating too quickly for the salary you're making, and the way our economy is going, and the lack of let's say salary increases that match inflation. It's just not happening. It's not happening.
And I want to.
The ROI is just not there.
Yes.
Okay.
Dr. Margot, please.
Yes. So I did want to add, I think one thing as we think about costs and also why it has increased, this is something I often discuss in higher education, is also how it's shifted, right? So whereas before, maybe it wasn't so much about the experience, now it's become more and more about what does this experience look like? So where it's not only about what you're doing in the classroom, but it's what are you doing outside of the classroom that's going to make you more competent for the job market. And that also increases cost, right? That might not necessarily be part of the tuition or the living expenses, but it's traveling to conferences, conducting research, whether, you know, and maybe having to go to these various sites or purchasing certain instruments, depending on what discipline you're in. And all of this also increases. I know that for me, one of the things that I really appreciate about SREB is that you do get a stipend, but there's also funding that goes towards attending a conference, or if you're conducting research, these funds are very important. And I think in some way, this also goes back to what Dr. Atwater was mentioning, which is that we have these disparities in terms of the networks that we have in place, right? Or maybe that we don't have in place in this case. And that leads to students of color, more so having to pay out of pocket for these experiences, and sometimes going into debt or taking out loans to be able to do those things, to participate in that way, with the hopes of getting a job at the end.
You know, and you're touching on some of the things. I will just say to you, to all of you, and to most of the people on this call who are part of this program know this. This is why programmatically we do some of the things we do in terms of trying to provide. You know, I wish we could help even more, because you need it. But you know, given the finances, we do what we can to enhance as many of those other kinds of skills and knowledge sets you need to have to be competitive when you get out of here. You know, if that's going to a conference, some money for research, doing those. Again, we love to do more, but resources drive what we can do. We do what we can, but it is some acknowledgement that, to your point, there are other kinds of costs that go with this in order to get you trained. Not any of you personally, but you as a group of students in this program, trained up and competitive, so that when you go out on these markets, you can compete with everybody on at the same level, having same or similar experiences that make you very, very competitive in that market. That's exactly the reasoning and rationale goes behind why we do what we do the way we do it. Dr. Perry, you were going to say something else, and I'm sorry, I cut you off a little bit.
No, I was just reiterating the point about return on investment that you were making, right? So again, a part of the decision-making process is, how much is it that I'm going to have to borrow to finance my education, and to what extent am I going to be able to expect to recoup that on the back end? And oftentimes, again, as you mentioned, depending upon the field or the position or the profession that one is considering, the answer is sometimes no, right? And again, you think about the implications for DEI considerations for colleges and universities across the campus. Something else that you alluded to, which is if and when folks are actually able to graduate, how competitive can they be when they found themselves having to sort of piece together their educations, right? So I'm familiar with folks who are graduate students, but they still work full-time, and in some cases work a full-time and a part-time job. And necessarily in intro to econ, they teach you about opportunity costs, right? Every decision you make doing A, you necessarily cannot do B. And so for every minute of the day that you're working at both full and part-time job to sort of piece together your education and also your living expenses, those are all minutes of the day that you can't spend, to your point, preparing a conference abstract, working on a manuscript, things that'll make you competitive against people whose time is a little bit freer and a little bit more their own on the job market. It's also the case that even when assistantships are available, if you have other types of responsibilities, those things simply aren't enough to cover those costs, and other people are free to take those assistantships and those opportunities, and then they get the intrinsic reward that, again, from an investment standpoint, from a competitive standpoint, from an attractiveness standpoint on the job market, makes them more competitive because they've worked with the mentor who they had opportunities to publish with or serve as a research assistant on his or her project. And now that person has a quote unquote pedigree that makes them much more attractive on the market and sets them up, because now they're in a position to go to sort of an R1 institution, and then again, the discrepancies just get magnified over and over again exponentially at each point in time. And so again, so these are real conversations, and we're in a space and we're in a moment where we're talking a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion, and this is an opportunity for us to emphasize the equity piece of it, because what we're seeing happening from an educational standpoint in terms of financing education has long-reaching implications well into people's careers. And again, there's also data, and I'm not telling you all anything that you don't already know, but there's also data to suggest that representation matters on college campuses. Yes. Right. And so when you don't have faculty of color, then you necessarily see associated dips and drops in students of color. And so when you look at sort of wealth disparities and wealth gaps, we see these things being perpetuated over and over again. And so these are, again, really meaningful conversations that necessarily need to be addressed at both a policy level as well as a programmatic level.
Yeah. So let me stay with that theme for a moment and ask all of you, you know, and Dr. Perry, you were just getting at it. You know, how does this whole debt matter come to impacting faculty diversity? You know, and you start to allude to, you know, how all the pieces start to stack up, and ultimately it has an impact on faculty diversity. What are some of you all's thoughts on how these things, how this debt burden, or how the current situation impacts faculty diversity? Any thoughts? Any additional thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So, listen, people who know me, they know I'm from an area where the benchmark for success was having a car with automatic windows, right? Right. If you didn't have to lean over and roll the window down, you were the man in my neighborhood. And so I say that to say that the idea of graduate school was not something that was sort of realistic for me until I got into college and had certain types of experiences and got connected from a social capital standpoint with professors and instructors who saw something in me that I didn't necessarily see in myself. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't have a discussion or conversation with my own students now where it becomes clear to me that I've seen something in them that they may not have seen in themselves. And so because I have an eye for that sort of thing, because I know what it looks like, because I've been on the other end of it. And I think it's easy for students to get lost in some of these institutions if and when they're able to get there, right? So the point about not only looking at recruitment, but also retention and persistence, I mean, those are real conversations because, again, getting there is just half the game, right? You necessarily need to be able to get through. And then again, once you're able to get through, you need to be well positioned to be able to apply what it is you've learned and make an impact. So, and again, all of these are sort of different milestones in that broader and that longer pipeline. And we're seeing, I work at an institution where the University of Louisville will tell you that it's the most diverse institution in the state of Kentucky, which is true, but it's also the case that it sits and is situated in the largest, most densely populated, metropolitan, diverse city in the state of Kentucky as well. So some of that is not necessarily that the University of Louisville has hustled all of those people up. Some of it is sort of serendipitous in that way, right? So the question then becomes, what is it that specifically the university is doing in terms of diversifying its faculty and its student body, because there's a connection between the two. And once we see these large, insurmountable, exorbitant student loans forcing people in a situation where they have to decide between being able to survive and financing their education, I think what you're going to see is a slow, and if we've not already seen it, maybe that we've already started to see some of the signs of it, but a slow sort of siphoning off and tailing off of the pipeline. And whatever progress we've made in the last 30, 40, 50 years, necessarily some of it starting to be rolled back, which again, I think is really, really unfortunate, because we never really achieved the type of equity and diversity and inclusion that we've set out to begin with, right? Even in places like the one where I work, where again, they tout themselves as the most diverse, it still doesn't even approximate the demographic makeup of the city, right? And so that's not to even speak on the institutions that aren't able to make the claim that they're the most diverse in their region. Right? What's going on in those places, right? And so, yeah, I think, again, those are the types of conversations that we necessarily need to have as it is we engage policymakers and administrators and decision makers about how it is that they stop divesting in public education, but double down on the investments.
Yes, yes. And you know, and that's why having this conversation, having you all hear the conversation, hear the arguments, hear the data, are so important because you all vote. And our policymakers, as I said, just look at the data, look at higher education investment for the last 30 years, and it's going in the wrong direction. And we keep wondering why students are going further in debt and parents are having a harder time paying. You know, I always respond to people, look, you know, it gets paid for one way or another, or if it doesn't, then people aren't going to get educated. And as a society, we can't afford that. So either you're paying taxes, and it's going to pay for it, or it's coming out of your pocket in the form of increased tuition. See, increased tuition is a form of taxation, quite honestly, because you gotta pay for the service. Institutions, there are real bills to be paid, and they have to exist. And if they're not getting state investment, then where else are they going to get it? Well, they get it from parents who are willing to pay those exorbitant tuition fees. Or if the parents can't pay, then the students, I mean, they catch it in the neck. I mean, that's the thing we're talking about. They catch it in the neck because what they see is that they have to incur the debt, that load, in order to get an education. And you know, as we're seeing, right, we're seeing the very beginnings of it. It becomes stifling, and to the point that it discourages people from considering or making the decision to actually take on that kind of a debt or any debt to go to school. I mean, that's what you're seeing is part of the president's relief package. That, you know, as part of that is what the trillions of dollars of, if you will, free education for the first 2 years of college. You know, and it said, you know, and I hate the use of the term free education because it's not free. Somebody's paying the bill. You know, that money is being paid for. It may not cost the individual, but it's not free by any chance to anyone. There are costs that go with it. Dr. Camargo, you know, on a more personal note, has, you know, that these debt load decisions impacted your journey to get your PhD as well? Did some of this figure into your thinking as you were coming through and making those decisions?
Yes, it did. So ever since undergraduate, I knew that I didn't want to ask my parents for money because there just wasn't any, right? So it was kind of like, as long as I can find a way to do it on my own, it's going to be fine. I'm sure my parents would have helped me if I had asked, but I don't know how they would have done it. I still don't know because it's especially not all the way up to the PhD level. It's just too many years. I think for me, something that helped was just being part of like the graduate school when I was completing my master's and kind of knowing a little bit about how that works. So I knew that I had to, if I was going to complete my PhD, I had to have a form of paying for it that wasn't going to be out of pocket because I didn't have the money for that. And I was trying to kind of piece it together, like funding in different ways. For me, where I was going to attend depended on the funding I was going to receive. And part of the reason why I applied to multiple institutions was not only to get accepted, right, or have like acceptance somewhere, but it was also to be able to have different, hopefully, funding packages. And that was part of the reason why I did that. I remember I was working and I was earning like $38,000 after my master's degree. And there was just no way. There was no way that, I don't even know what my salary would have been if I had not completed a PhD. Not to say that you earn so much more, but I mean, my salary has at least doubled, right? But I also have debt now, which is like,
that kind of goes with the territory. Yes.
Right. And I have a daughter, and I'm thinking, okay, I have to pay my debt, and now I have to also be saving for my daughter's education. And that gets really hard to do. And I think that's part of the trajectory of being a first generation PhD student, right? Like that, you have to make certain decisions, because oftentimes it's not just about you as an individual going to complete this degree. It's about, how does this impact all of my family or all of these people who might be depending on me? And how do I make it work in relation to that? Right. So I remember having a conversation with my parents when I was finishing my master's degree, and I was like, I think I'm going to go for my PhD. And they were supportive, but they were also questioning, like, well, when are you going to get a job? Because like, you need to start earning money as well. And that's the sacrifice that we also make. There's an urgency for you to start on that return on your investment, like to see it, right? And completing a PhD is kind of going against that. If you're going to take out debt, it's like you're not just not working, but now you're also taking out debt. So it is a sacrifice in all those ways. This is, I think, why we see that it impacts negatively the faculty diversity that we have. I currently have a student who is, he's a Latino student, and he's looking to go into a PhD program, and he needs the funding. And he told me, if I don't get funded, I'm not going to take out loans. I'm going to wait. I'm not going to, he's been accepted to 2 institutions, but that's part of, and I completely understand. He's like, I already have too much debt. And I see so much potential, right, in terms of bringing him into academia. And I'm trying to do what I can to find funding. But again, my networks are also very limited. I'm still kind of building those as a first gen PhD faculty member. And that's the other thing. Like we want to help students, and we want to be supportive of them, but we also are still building these networks. Yeah.
Absolutely. So before, I want to make sure we leave some time for our participants to weigh in a little bit as well. From what you all are all seeing, experiencing right now, what kind of policy changes at the institutional, state, or federal level do you think we should consider making in order to improve this situation? I really like to get your thoughts on what kind of policy changes do you think would put us in a better place, help these students. Dr. Camargo, like help that student. You see people with great potential, with great skill to be able to handle the work at the graduate level, but the hurdles are just too tall for them to get over, and they make other kind of decisions. Dr. Atwater.
Yeah, so I am fortunate at Georgia Tech to lead what we call our focus program, where we bring over 200 students of color interested in graduate studies and really try to equip them on the front side. Some of these conversations are things with faculty of color and others of color to say, okay, how can you, where you are in your junior and senior year of undergrad, prepare well for this, right? The things that you may not know, because as Dr. Camargo said, many of us are first gen, right? Even thinking about grad school, let alone actually going and that type of thing to equip them. And so I do think that's one policy, that being more intentional of how we prepare even at the undergraduate level to consider graduate studies and what it would take, and to equip others appropriately with that, and the policies and programmatic piece, the attaching some of the undergraduate acceptance into master's education and covering it. The other policy is how we look at funding. We are still a lot of times on these 4 to 5 year limited structured funding structures without attaching that to degree completion. And what I mean that, like, we don't know how long it's going to take you to get done. And so, we find a lot of times that people are okay those first 3 to 4 years. It's after that, it's when that degree completion is taking a little longer that the debt becomes to compound, right? That you did the work, you might have had the fellowships and the scholarships, but hit that 4/5, which is quite true for a lot of our students of color, because as we mentioned previously, they're managing a little extra on their load to get through this. It's not just the straight academia aspect of it. So I say policies around funding based on need and degree program completion, not just this hypothetical
kind of fixed point in time,
standardized,
yeah.
right? It takes this long, so this is where we do funding type of policies. I also think we have work to do, at Georgia Tech. The pushback I put on our graduate admissions, they were saying, well, we can't do certain base type of funding support, and I believe that we can. Whether that takes partnering with external entities, so being a state school, and being where you rank, that's great. But if it requires then partnering with and being intentional with your community partners, I heard Dr. Perry say Louisville situated as well. Well, we're situated in the city of Atlanta. If anybody can leverage between the multiple partners and be intentional about then how we leverage all our respective roles to support this trajectory, that the whole citizenship benefit from, if we can get that aligned, right? So there's economic enterprise, there's entrepreneurial realms, let alone funding sources, let alone institutional and higher educational partners, that if we're strategic through the whole pathway, we can do a little bit more from a policy aspect, and even beyond just saying where do state and federal dollars go, as those get fluctuated and depending on who get elected. We can have some strategies across our interinstitutional networks and policies to say we're going to navigate that. And the last thing is, I think there should be a little pressure on institutions to balance out who you're accepting and who you're supporting, and what job market, being honest with people and preparing them well for the market they're going into. We talked about there are some differences across fields and disciplines, right? But institutions are aware. And so if you're bringing in graduate students for placement and production into markets, then we need to be mindful and held accountable for what that looks like. If your PhD cohort is dominantly unfunded, part-time, and the institution's making money, but not only are you matching them accurate with advisors and making sure they have what they need to be highly competitive in the job market, and just leaving them awry. I think there are definitely areas we can work on to impact across the board.
Excellent. Thank you. You touched on a couple of really hot buttons for me. I'd love to, this could go on for a little while. Dr. Camargo, Dr. Perry, any thoughts about policy changes that you all would like to see that that might impact this topic? Debt.
So I think, I'm sorry, you can go ahead. I talked a little bit. Go, Dr. Perry.
No. I was waiting on you. Go ahead.
No, I think that, we talk about this all the time, like loan forgiveness, but I think that these maybe like a matching type of, like, you take out this amount and we'll fund half of it, is something that we probably need to invest more as a country into the fields that we need to grow diversity in. And that goes into being more intentional with how we create policy. So thinking about the gaps that we have as a society, because we all obviously benefit as a country depending on, on the educational attainment of our population, right? And that hasn't been the case at all in the way that policy has been implemented before. We often see it, implemented as being race neutral, and that that the argument is that it's going to benefit everyone, but when it comes down to implementation, that has never been the case. So we have to have policy that is not gender neutral. I would say is a big part of it.
Good.
I mean, not gender neutral, race, yeah.
Race, gender, yeah,
neutral,
understood. And gender neutral as well, because it's not equal there either, or equitable, not equal, but equitable there either. Dr. Perry, give you the last word on this.
Yeah, I was just typing into the chat that my concern around policy is that we live in a country that is turning its back on education and science, right? And so if for the last 30 years, if what we've seen is a slow but steady rolling back of funding for education, like what are we expecting out of elected officials who don't have the courage to stand up for knowledge and science and data? Right? We have people who again, unless I'm missing something, there's an all-out war on intellectualism, right? And about half of our country has signed up to fight that war. I mean, not to be tongue in cheek, but we can't even get people to put on a mask when science says this is a life-preserving measure. So so even the most self-serving person would say, if for no other reason, I'm going to put this thing on, right? People are rejecting that in the name of what they're calling freedom and liberty. And so if and when we show up, the PhD folks, we become typecast as the elites who are looking to indoctrinate people, right? And so we're seeing state after state with the elected officials, they're signing off on some things that that I think are real threats. And so I have some real concerns about whether or not those folks have the political will and I think just downright courage to stand up and do what many of us know what's right in terms of education, for all the reasons that my colleagues mentioned in terms of what an educated society means for the health and growth of our nation. But it seems as though politics is becoming much more of a powerful draw than what's prudent and what's in our best interest. And so I think that has to be resolved in some way before we can even get to a discussion or conversation around fully funding education, I would think, at the K through 12 level or even higher ed.
Yeah, agree. Well, let me stop right here and give our participants a chance to, you can unmute. I mean, I think we're a small enough group, or put it in chat. Veronica, are there any questions in chat that would be pertinent to this, or that we can put out to this group? Or like I said, you all can unmute and pose your question or make a comment. We'd like to have you all weigh in a little bit on this discussion as well.
Well, Dr. Abraham, there's been actually quite a good chat going on in the chat, particularly around the gender gap, and also, let's see here, and please forgive me for having to scroll back up, and then salary based on geographic location. But one thing I wanted to also bring up, during our info session, we also talked about the fact that universities are moving away from tenure track positions.
Yeah.
And that was something that I think I would like to hear the panelists discuss real quick if they can, to give some perspective on that and how that affects faculty diversity.
Panelists, any quick thoughts on the fact that we are having fewer tenure track positions and we're going more to contracted professors, contracted employees in the professoriate? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Dr. Camargo, you've been more recently out on the market. Dr. Perry, you've been in the academy for a little while. Are you seeing those things on your campuses? Dr. Atwaters, sorry.
I don't know if the other two want to respond. I think I did bring it up in the info session because it is a real concern, particularly in certain disciplines, right? And what that does, I think each of us are wearing so many, weighing out so many options here, or opportunities. I think if you find yourself faced with the increase of adjunct and visiting scholars, some people view it as a way in, right? It's kind of like your postdoc decision. Do I temporarily take this to get to the connections I want that when a tenure track position open up? Some people like the flexibility. I think, they use it as a strategy to move and say, okay, I'm gonna do 2 years here and I know where I want to go, and building your own portfolio. And I would say if you find yourself in that, that's probably the best way. Use it to empower where you likely would want to go. I think the impact of it, unfortunately, is that still when you come on faculty, there's expectations besides just the teaching load.
Right.
Students are still going to want the mentoring. I think I kind of touched on this with the women of color. There's the committee appointments. There's all of that still happens, and one has to be careful what that means for your own career when, if you are tenure track, or a lot of, I could say the number of assistant professors who come in, and all of this get added on and add to the debt in the faculty, and getting tenure becomes an added issues that still have them moving around, where visiting faculty and adjunct faculty have a little bit more flexibility sometimes, but the pay is less in ways, right? Unless you leverage it and within the thing. So it's a mixed bag for me. I think flexibility could be a win if that's the direction we're going, and just making sure one using it for their own benefit. I think the tenure track model, we're going to see changes in it one way or the other, just because of where academia is going, and one can plan for that, and also what these elevation points, or these promotion points mean, and how to be well prepared in the midst of dealing with debt, in the midst of dealing with the other demands. And when you're one of few on the faculty, those are increased in ways that sometimes we don't plan as much for. And so I think having even a network that helps you through mentoring, and that's a good thing SRB does provide, that your mentors and your support and your network don't need to be just at your institution, because you may move quicker than you anticipate or want to have those options. And so being plugged in across institutions may also be a strategy around the lack of the number of tenure track positions out there.
Excellent. Thank you for your comment.
Yeah,
Dr. Perry, Dr. Camargo, any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I was just going to say that at our university, and I think universities across the country, just the idea of tenure is under attack and has been for quite some time. It's also the case that we're seeing places like the University of North Carolina denying tenure to people who are clearly qualified and deserving, and folks are just being bold and brazen and making decisions that run counter to common sense. And so again, and I think it's consistent with the anti-intellectualism that I was just talking about. I think those things go hand in hand. And as folks have been mentioning in the chat, all of these issues are exacerbated and magnified exponentially the more intersectional identities one is associated with and represents. And so I think, again, it's really, really important that we be mindful of that and continue to uplift that as a part of the discussion and the conversation as well.
Well, thank you all to be very mindful.
Sorry.
Yes, please.
I was just going to add
Last
one more
word.
thing.
Yes.
No, I think that one of the things, as we think about faculty diversity more like on the research side, and how having non-tenure track or fewer positions that are non-tenure track, academic freedom, we talk about that all the time. And I do worry about what does that mean in terms of your contract and what we're able to research, right? Because what we're able to write about and how these issues impact communities of color. And I think that's something that something just as a concern as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that going to commenting on what you just brought up in Dr. Perry's um, identification of what's going on in North Carolina at the moment. Yeah, and I would add that, and who's making those decisions? Yeah, yeah. You know, when it starts to get outside the academy, and you got, if you will, politicians weighing in on that kind of decision making, well, we got a, you know, we got a mess is what we have. And who's manning the store? Who's really running the place? And you gotta look very closely and watch where these decisions are being made. Because it's yeah, some of what I'm reading these days is very disturbing. But I will say it's worth all of us fighting for. I mean, we're having these kind of discussions, raising all our awareness, our knowledge about these issues, because we all may be in the boat of fighting for the rights we want to see people in the academy have, the rights we want, the fact that we want to see more people of color in front of those classrooms. We may have to, you know, we're gonna have to fight for this, because nobody's gonna just say, hey, yeah, we think that's a great idea, and we're gonna make sure that happens. Yeah, we're gonna have to fight for every face in front of those classrooms. You just have to put up the arguments, intellectually engage in these discussions, and hopefully we can come out at the end of the day in a place where we're able to get more students coming through, lessen their loads, and having them make the decisions we would like to see them make, as going on to grad school, going on to earn their PhDs, and ultimately have their faces in front of the academy. I want to thank everybody, be mindful of everybody's time and their energies. Thank our panelists for your efforts, attention, willingness to be here and to engage in this discussion. We appreciate all of you very much. And I love seeing all of you all the time. It gives me another opportunity to engage with our graduates. So good to see you all. Veronica, any last words about the session? It will be available to those if you missed anything. It is being recorded and we will post it. Any other words, Ms. Johnson, as we close out today's session?
No, I think you handled all of it, Dr. Abraham. So thank you.
All right, thank all of you for your time this afternoon. I hope you will be back and stay tuned for our next webinar. We'll announce that very soon. Thank you all. Thanks, panelists. Great seeing all of you.